Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I painted this hippo in acrylics. Now the first stage here for me is the background. They are behind the subject, so it makes sense in that layering process to paint this first. Now there are many different ways to get to the same end, but I do certainly find that if I've got my background in, I can better judge the way that I want that subject to look with my values and the colour. Now I don't like painting on the white of my canvas, or in this case the wooden panel, so I have started with this green base mix and now I'm starting to paint the water. Now having a mid-tone of a similar colour that the water is just helps for me to better judge my values going forward, rather than the bright white of a canvas for example. Now as I started to paint the water, you will see at times here that there is a fine misting of water that's being applied. Now this is where I'm using my wet on wet blending techniques to create more of a soft blend. Now the faster drying time of acrylics is often a criticism of this medium, but I actually find it's an advantage. Because using a fine mist spray bottle like this, we can actually keep this paint wet for hours if needed. We don't have to be always restricted with that fast drying time. But where we do want to speed through that layering process and really enhance that level of depth fairly quickly, we can use that drying time to our advantage. Now as I continue to work on the background, I'm really just mapping in my main lights and darks. Any bright highlights in the water, I'm going to be indicating at that with more of a light blue. But I want to be here focusing on the way that the water is moving. So whether or not that's more left to right, or whether or not the slightly lighter ripple at times is going to be more curved, I do want to be focusing on that rather than detail. Now something that I do feel makes a big difference with any base layer, regardless if it's the subject or something like this with the background, is that we have a soft layer. There's no harsh start and stop points here. Now if the base layer has this degree of blend, it means then that we're not fighting with harsh edges as we continue with that layering process. And this importance of softness will become more noticeable as we do start to layer those details. Now all of this is done through wet on wet blending. So if you find that your paints are drying quicker, this of course is going to depend on the environment, even potentially the paints that you're using. Use more of that misting of the water with a fine mist spray bottle. That will really help, but you don't want to add too much that water starts to run down your surface. If that happens, or you're getting large droplets or gatherings of water, then you've added far too much and that paint will actually then overblend or even start to lift off of your surface. So practicing experimenting with how much water and when to mist, I do find that that's going to really gain the confidence the more that we use that technique. When I first used a spray bottle, I found it a very alien thing to incorporate in my acrylic paintings, but now it's a tool that I wouldn't want to be without. Now in the real-time versions of these tutorials, I do like to simplify any of the techniques as much as I can, especially with blending, because of how difficult this aspect of working with acrylics can be. So when I'm working with these layers here, the mid stages on top of my base foundation, I don't use my fine mist spray bottle as much. Instead, I'm actually adding the paint and then I'm using a separate brush to soften or blend the edges. Now this gives more of a controlled way of using these techniques. It means that we can really simplify and break down this process that much more. And this is also why I use glazes, which is what I'm doing at the moment. You can see that the colour of this water has been changed quite considerably, and I haven't yet had to mix the exact colour at each of my layers I've added up to this point. Now I do have a little video here on YouTube that speaks all about glazes, how to use them, when to use them, and why they can be so effective. If that video is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. But with acrylics, working with glazes, we don't have that stress of having to mix those colours at each layer as I've just mentioned. This can be a massive game changer when working with this wonderful medium. Now this really does also help then to gain confidence again with how we can mix those colours, how we can layer those colours, if we don't have the pressure of having to do that accurate at each individual stage. Now in most cases I really don't care if the colour isn't right, because I know I can adjust that within seconds with the use of a glaze. Now if that is something that you would like to see in more depth, then I do cover this in every single one of my real-time tutorials. I'll link the information to those in the description below as well if they are of interest. Now, as I'm continuing here, not once have I used my glazes again since the last time I've mentioned it. I'm just building up my values here, and then later on I'll work with another glaze again. So by doing this, I'm able to work with one layer at a time far more effectively because I'm not having to worry about everything all at the same layer. Now at this stage, this is where I'm really starting to enhance my contrast. So in order to make the water look reflective, shiny and wet, the contrast is crucial. This is the same if we are painting metal, anything that has that bright reflection where we're trying to make that look shimmery. Now I've made sure that my layers underneath are dark enough, so now when I come back in with these highlights, they're looking that much brighter because the darker values are established. Now if the layers underneath are not dark enough, these highlights will appear dull. They won't be as bright. So if that is something that you notice in your own work, then it can be an indication that your shadows, those darker values, need to be that much darker. If you're using titanium white, one of your brightest paints that you have, and those highlights aren't bright enough, it is then a clear indicator that the contrast isn't right. Those darker values need to be enhanced. Now as I continue to layer, I'm now starting to work on more of those lighter highlights. So this is the reflections that are sitting more on the very top surface of the water. I've switched to a smaller, more detailed brush so that I can do this. Now the exact brushes to use here is really not important. I like to use a range of brushes, some generic. I like my Daler and Rowney, I like Winsor and Newton, but I use a range of different brands just to show that it's not the exact brush, it's more about how we use those brushes. Now in order to build up these kinds of details, the amount of pressure that we use on a brush is crucial. So as I say, it doesn't matter what brush we use, if we are adding too much pressure, those lines are still going to always be far too thick. So using lighter pressure, I can maintain this thinner look to the brush stroke, but having a smaller sized brush is making that easier to achieve. Now this is only a small painting, it is 4 by 6 inches, which is actually very small for this kind of level of realism. So in order to still capture that high level of realism, the way that we're using the brushes, the contrast and the layering process are really important. Now these smaller paintings are great for breaking up the routine. Maybe if we've been working on some larger, more complex paintings, we don't want to jump straight into another difficult painting. That's a very good way of getting burnt out very quickly. So fitting in these smaller paintings where we are working with specific techniques, it's never time wasted. We are always refining the brush techniques here, gaining confidence with how we layer and blend, but without having to spend days, loads of hours at the easel on one painting. They are incredibly motivational, the fact that we can get this level of realism on a small painting within a few hours. Now as I continued to work on the Hippo itself, you can see that the techniques are very similar. I'm working with applying the paint and then using another brush to blend and soften those layers. Now the layering process, again, it is crucial. I can't just work with 2 or 3 layers here because at this stage, that reflection in the water, it looks unfinished, it looks a bit messy. But we need to be bearing in mind that this is all about the gradual layering process and the importance of getting each layer right and where it should be for the amount of depth we're trying to create. Now at this stage here, there is a lot of little white highlights on the skin that I'm desperate to add. But just like the whiskers, they are overlapping everything else. They're sitting on the very top. So we do want to leave those details for the last layers. Always remembering that it's going to help give that wet, shiny look to the skin, but delaying that until we're ready for those layers and details. And then as before, once I was happy with the layers and values here, building up more dark to light, this is still sort of at my mid-tone stage, but this is where I felt I needed to adjust the colour. And then I worked with glazes, more of that burnt sienna mix to give me a little bit more of that richer tone. And then of course having a little bit more of the purple either side because the skin colour here is not the same overall. We're going to have slightly more purples in the shadowed areas and then more of that richer brown, slightly orange colour to the areas that are catching more light. Now the other thing to mention there is if you are using glazes to adjust your colour and you have adjusted it and you don't like it, it doesn't replicate that reference photo as it should, you can simply just paint over it. The way that we work with glazes, you can use a combination of glazes to achieve the final colour. It's not even necessarily about worrying about mixing that glaze at that right time, and it has to be perfect. We can build the glazes up, and exactly what I'm doing here. I needed to have a little bit more of an orange richness to this colour, so I've come back in and added another glaze. I've made that colour saturation more vibrant, and that's helped to raise that part of the eye up. This is now copying and replicating more of the actual structure of this animal. Now where I have worked with these glazes, I will need to come back in with more highlights over the top because it still does look a little bit flat. The way that glazes work, there is of course a degree of colour there, that's what we're using them for, but it might actually darken the highlights a little bit too much. So while I'm waiting for this glaze to dry, I can work on the ear and then I can always come back and adjust my values again later on. Using this layering approach and how we can build up this depth in stages means then that something here that's actually quite complex to do is far easier to tackle because it is very much one layer at a time. Now the other reason why I love working this way is because there might come a point where we think, oh, I've missed that bit out, I need to make an adjustment. And this is one of those times. So I knew that I needed to add in the colour of the hippo's skin into the top reflections on the lower edge of the water. So I've simply come in with a lighter value. It's actually not the right colour at all, it's more of a light blue. I've then indicated at that, waited for it to dry, and now I'm coming back in with the glaze colour that I used on the skin and then adjusted those highlights. And very quickly here I've been able to incorporate something in my painting that I had previously missed out up to this point. It is such a forgiving way of working with this wonderful medium. So now I've got more of the hippo painted in, this is where you can see I've got a clear difference between my warm colours and my cool colours. The area here on the face, it is in shadow, it's not hitting that direct light source, so therefore I've used more purples in my mix. Now having this sharp difference here I do want to capture, especially on these smaller paintings. This is going to help reinforce the realism where I don't have lots of room for finer details. Now at this stage I'm just tweaking those lighter midtones, still not my brightest highlights, but this is also helping to create more of a softness to the skin texture. Now because this has a very thin layer of water over the top of the hippo because it's just come out from under the water, this area of the skin is going to look a little bit smoother than it would if the skin was dry. So the amount of blending that we do here will need to be adjusted depending on the reference photo that we're working from. So again, my biggest tip here is to make sure that your contrasts are right. You want your shadows to be dark enough and those midtones to be bright enough. But at this point, it's not your highlights as such, because your brightest highlights we want to save for your later layers. Now, although the paint that I'm first of all applying looks brighter, by the time I've softened and blended it out, it goes more transparent, so it actually then ends up slightly darker. So having the combination here, the range of techniques is going to help with this. But it's the softness, the smooth look of the skin that I really want to capture as much as the values here. And once I was happy with everything now, I can start to consider more of those top highlights, those finishing details. So with this little detailed brush, I've actually just dipped this in some of my titanium white. There's no water in this mix, and that means then it's more opaque. It's not thinned down and therefore slightly transparent. This will help to get those highlights nice and bright. Now I personally am quite guilty of overdoing these details in my previous earlier work. So when I get to these stages in my paintings, I always take a little bit more of my time. So I'll add in a few of these top highlights as you've seen, and then I'll start to work on something else and I can always then come back to that area previously so that I know I'm not overdoing the details in that area. Because these highlights shouldn't be added everywhere, that will change the light source as well. So these brightest highlights, it's where that light is catching those areas of the face. So if we start adding too many bright highlights where there's shadows, then it's not going to make sense. It will make the lighting more overall rather than slightly one-sided in this case. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in painting along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then I'll link all of the information in the description as well. I am going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.